At 1 minute past midnight on August 22nd, 2026, the United States and Canada crossed a line that both governments had spent more than a year trying to avoid. A 50% tariff on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods snapped into force automatically, without a signature, without a press conference, without a single American official standing at a podium to announce it. It simply happened, the way a deadline happens when nobody blinks. Hockey sticks, tongue depressors, dairy powder, plywood, cement, children's toys. All of it suddenly twice as expensive to bring across the world's longest undefended border. And within hours, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney did something no Canadian leader had done in this entire trade war. He didn't just complain. He didn't just absorb it and wait for the next round of talks. He picked up the phone, recalled his own negotiating team from Washington, and told the country that Canada was done asking nicely. Here is what most people scrolling past the headlines are missing. This was not a sudden blow-up. This was the collapse of the closest thing to a finished deal that Canada and the United States had produced in more than a year of negotiating. By some accounts, the two sides were within days, maybe hours, of an agreement that would have rolled back tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, and then it fell apart anyway. That detail changes the entire story because it means this was not a failure of communication. It was a collision between two governments that fundamentally disagree about what a fair deal looks like, and about who has the leverage to define fairness in the first place. To understand why a near deal exploded into a fresh tariff war between two of the most economically intertwined nations on Earth, you have to go back through 18 months of escalation, walk through exactly what these new tariffs actually hit, and understand why Mark Carney decided that the political cost of walking away was smaller than the cost of signing. This didn't start in August. It started on February 1st, 2025, when the Trump administration opened a trade offensive against both of its North American neighbors, Canada and Mexico, citing border security and fentanyl trafficking as the initial justification before the conversation shifted, as it almost always does with this administration, toward the trade deficit and the health of American manufacturing. Justin Trudeau was still Prime Minister when the first tariffs landed. Canada hit back immediately, matching the American measures dollar for dollar under Trudeau's government, a pattern of retaliation that would define the entire conflict going forward. By March, Mark Carney had taken over as Prime Minister, inheriting a trade war that was barely a month old and would end up defining the first year and a half of his premiership. Tariffs on steel and aluminum arrived that spring at 25%. Canada matched them. Auto tariffs followed. Canada matched those too, while also facing pressure from provincial premiers who wanted a harder line, and from industry groups who wanted the whole fight to end before it destroyed cross-border supply chains that had taken 30 years to build under the original NAFTA framework, and its successor, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known as USMCA. For a while, in the second half of 2025, it looked like the temperature might actually be dropping. In September, Canada removed many of its retaliatory tariffs on American goods, keeping the surtaxes on steel, aluminum, and autos in place, but lifting duties on a long list of other products. It was framed as a goodwill gesture, a signal that Ottawa wanted to de-escalate and get back to the negotiating table for real. Carney said publicly around that time that he believed Canada was getting the best trade terms of any country dealing with the Trump administration. A notable statement given how bruising the relationship had already become. Through the fall and winter, both governments kept talking, kept adjusting remission periods on tariffs for manufacturers who depended on cross-border steel and aluminum, and kept circling the same unresolved questions about autos, lumber, and critical minerals. Then, in January 2026, a new front opened that had nothing to do with tariffs directly, but everything to do with trust. Carney traveled to China and met with President Xi Jinping, and the two countries reached a preliminary trade agreement, allowing close to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market annually at a sharply reduced tariff rate, down from the 100% duty Canada had imposed in coordination with Washington back in 2024. In exchange, China agreed to ease its retaliatory tariffs on Canadian canola, pork, and seafood, sectors that had been hammered by Beijing's countermeasures. From Ottawa's perspective, this was a narrow defensive move, protecting Canadian farmers from a Chinese trade war that Canada had inherited by aligning with American-China policy in the first place. From Washington's perspective, it looked like something else entirely. President Trump threatened a full 100% tariff on Canadian goods if Ottawa pursued a broader free trade relationship with Beijing. And at the World Economic Forum in Davos that January, he publicly accused China of, in his words, taking over Canada. Carney pushed back immediately, stating flatly that Canada had no intention of pursuing a comprehensive free trade agreement with China, and that the deal was limited to specific sectors already under strain. But the episode revealed something important. Trump was treating Canada's independent foreign economic policy as a loyalty test, and Carney was refusing to fail it on Washington's terms, while also refusing to fully capitulate. That underlying tension, sovereignty versus market access, is the current running underneath everything that happened in August. Because by the summer of 2026, both governments were staring down a new deadline created by an unusual and rarely used piece of American trade law. On July 20th, President Trump signed a proclamation invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a statute that dates back nearly a century and had almost never been used in modern trade policy. Section 338 gave the president authority to impose tariffs of up to 50% on goods from a country the administration determined was discriminating against American commerce. And critically, unlike the more commonly used Section 232 national security tariffs on steel and aluminum, these Section 338 duties were written to override existing trade agreements entirely. That included USMCA, products that had enjoyed duty-free treatment under the Continental Trade Pact for years because they qualified as North American in origin, would lose that protection outright if the 50% tariff took hold. The proclamation set a 30-day clock. The tariffs would take effect automatically at 1 minute past midnight on August 19th, unless a new deal was reached, later extended by a few days as last-minute talks intensified in Washington. The list of products caught in that net was deliberately broad, and reading through it tells you a lot about how this White House thinks about economic pressure. There was a dairy list covering milk, cream, whey, and related dairy ingredients, a direct shot at Canada's protected supply-managed dairy sector, which has been a sticking point in American trade demands for years. There was a second list that officials, somewhat confusingly, labeled under a motor vehicles heading, even though it contained essentially no automobiles at all. Instead, that list swept in electronics and telecom equipment, furniture and home goods, building materials like lumber, plywood, doors and cement, plastics and packaging, clothing, footwear, luggage, toys, sporting goods, industrial machinery and manufacturing inputs, cosmetics and fragrances, and agricultural products, ranging from flowers to seeds. In total, more than a dozen distinct Canadian industries found themselves inside the blast radius of a single proclamation. Notably excluded were energy products, potash, fish, and critical minerals, sectors where American industry and consumers remained deeply dependent on Canadian supply, and where a sudden 50% tariff would have inflicted immediate, visible pain on the American side of the border. Steel and aluminum, along with autos, were also left out of this particular action, because those sectors were already governed by the existing Section 232 tariffs Trump had imposed earlier in his term. And, in fact, buried inside the same policy package, the administration actually lowered tariffs on certain steel and aluminum derivative products, like agricultural machinery and HVAC equipment, from 25% down to 15%. That detail matters, because it shows this wasn't simply blanket economic warfare. It was targeted pressure designed to hurt specific sectors, protect politically sensitive American industries from retaliation, and leave the door open for a negotiated exit if Canada came back with concessions Washington wanted. For a moment, it looked like that negotiated exit was actually within reach. Through the final week before the deadline, negotiators from both countries held extended rounds of talks in Washington, and multiple reports described the two sides as genuinely close, working through a package that would have cut the existing Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos in exchange for Canadian concessions elsewhere. Carney later revealed publicly just how far Canada had been willing to go. He said Canada had offered to drop its remaining retaliatory tariffs on American steel, aluminum, and autos entirely, and to actively encourage Canadian provinces, several of which had banned American alcohol from store shelves in protest, to lift those bans and let American liquor, wine, and beer back onto Canadian shelves. That last point is not a small detail. Provincial alcohol bans had already devastated American exporters. According to figures released by the Trump administration itself, Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages had collapsed by roughly 81% year over year, falling to around $137 million. For the period from March 2025 through February 2026, down from $718 million in the same period a year earlier. That is not a modest dip. That is an entire category of American exports functionally erased from the Canadian market by provincial policy, and American liquor industry representatives were describing it as an unfolding disaster for their members. So Canada came to the table with real, substantial offers on the table: tariff removal on the sectors most sensitive to Washington, and a path back to normalized alcohol trade for American producers. In return, Ottawa was asking for what it considered reasonable trade-offs: protections for its automotive sector, continued exemptions for goods that complied with USMCA's rules of origin, and critically, no exclusive American claim over Canadian critical minerals, a sector that has become geopolitically explosive given global competition with China over rare earths, lithium, and other materials essential to defense and clean energy technology. And this is where the deal broke. According to Carney, in the final hours, Washington's negotiators introduced new demands and altered terms that had reportedly already been agreed upon earlier in the week. Carney described the shift bluntly, saying the United States asked too much and offered too little, and that the last-minute changes were unfair, economically unsound, and called into question whether any deal reached with this administration could be considered reliable. Late Friday night, August 21st, he gave the order. Recall the negotiating team. Come home. No deal. The American side tells a mirrored version of that story, and it matters to understand it because this wasn't a one-sided collapse. It was a breakdown in trust running in both directions. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer responded almost immediately, saying it was Canada that declined to finalize the agreement under terms both sides had supposedly settled earlier that week. Greer argued that Washington had offered Canada the best treatment of any major exporter to the American market, including meaningful reductions on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber tariffs, protections. Canada had spent more than a year fighting for. In his telling, it was Canada that introduced new demands and walked back prior commitments in the final stretch, upending a carefully balanced package. Greer framed the entire episode as the direct consequence of what he called a year of Canadian retaliation that Washington was no longer willing to simply absorb. Whichever side blinked first in the room, the practical result was identical: no agreement, automatic tariffs. A trade relationship between two of the closest allies on Earth thrown back into open conflict, this time with the stakes considerably higher than where things stood in early 2025. Because here's the detail that turns this from a policy story into a genuine strategic rupture. This isn't just about the price of Canadian lumber or American bourbon anymore. It's about whether the entire architecture of North American trade, the USMCA framework that Trump himself negotiated during his first term and that all three governments are legally required to review by June of 2026, can survive contact with a president willing to bypass it entirely using century-old emergency statutes. Former Canadian Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, who helped negotiate the original USMCA and its predecessor, made a striking observation about what Carney was actually doing by even engaging with Section 338 tariffs on these terms. She noted that by accepting the legitimacy of tariffs imposed outside the trade agreement's dispute mechanisms, rather than fighting them purely through USMCA's formal legal channels, Carney was crossing a line no previous Canadian government had crossed, effectively conceding that the president can tariff Canada whenever he judges it necessary, agreement or no agreement. Whether that concession was strategic realism or a dangerous precedent is exactly the kind of question that will define how historians eventually judge this period of Canadian foreign policy. Carney, for his part, wasn't hiding from the political risk of walking away. Standing in front of reporters the morning after the deadline passed, he called the new 50% tariffs, in his own words, a miscalculation, arguing that this kind of pressure campaign would ultimately backfire on the very industries and workers the American side claimed to be protecting. When a reporter pressed him on whether it felt like he was, in effect, taking the country to war, Carney didn't flinch from the framing, choosing instead to reassert that Canada's negotiators had operated in good faith for more than a year, and that the line had to be drawn somewhere. That same day, in a public statement, he laid out the retaliation plan directly, telling Canadians that the country would match the new American tariffs dollar for dollar, protecting Canadian workers, farmers, families, and businesses, with full details to follow in the days ahead, and the countermeasures set to take effect the Tuesday after Labor Day, September 8th. The shape of that retaliation, once details emerged, was carefully targeted rather than reflexively broad, mirroring the same logic Washington had used in reverse. Canada's new tariffs are set to hit American steel, dairy products, home appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. Notice what's on that list and what isn't. Steel is a deliberate pressure point since Canada remains one of the largest foreign suppliers of that metal into the American market. And a tariff there raises costs for American manufacturers who depend on integrated North American steel supply chains, not just Canadian exporters. Dairy is a direct mirror of the American dairy tariffs Ottawa is absorbing. A tit-for-tat strike at politically sensitive farm states. Agricultural equipment and appliances hit American manufacturing directly in states where factory jobs are already a politically charged subject. This is not random retaliation. It is engineered to be felt in specific congressional districts by specific industries in a way that creates domestic political pressure on the Trump administration from within its own coalition, the same strategy Canada, and for that matter the European Union, has used throughout this broader era of tariff conflict, targeting goods for their political weight as much as their economic value. Domestically, Carney's decision to walk away rather than sign received a notable show of support from across Canada's fractured political landscape, a landscape that includes premiers who have often clashed bitterly with the federal government on other issues. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, no reflexive ally of Ottawa on many files, said publicly that while the new American tariffs would genuinely hurt Canadian producers, Carney had been right not to accept what Moe described as unfair and unreliable terms. That kind of cross-provincial backing matters enormously in Canadian politics, where trade disputes with the United States have a long history of exposing fault lines between export-heavy Western provinces and manufacturing-heavy Central Canada. For now, at least, the country appears to be presenting a largely unified front, even as industry groups warn that the pain from these tariffs, layered on top of 18 months of prior disruption, is only going to intensify the longer the standoff continues. Step back from the individual tariff lines for a moment, because the real significance of this moment is bigger than any single sector. $20 billion in newly tariffed goods sounds enormous, and it is, but in context, it represents only around 5% of everything Canada ships into the American market in a given year. On its own, that slice is unlikely to meaningfully move inflation numbers for American consumers, who are already dealing with elevated costs elsewhere in the economy, particularly at the gas pump. The real damage isn't in the $20 billion of goods directly hit. It's in what this collapse signals about the durability of the entire North American trading system going into its formal USMCA review next year. If a nearly finished deal can implode in a matter of hours over demands introduced at the 11th hour, every business on both sides of the border, making long-term investment decisions, building new factories, signing multi-year supply contracts, opening new production lines, has to price in the possibility that any future agreement carries the same fragility. That uncertainty is arguably more expensive over time than the tariffs themselves. It helps to understand just how deep this economic relationship actually runs, because that depth is precisely what makes this standoff so dangerous for both economies, not just Canada's. The integration between these two countries was not built overnight. It was engineered deliberately, starting with the original Canada-U. Free Trade Agreement in 1988, expanded into the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994 once Mexico joined, and then modernized into USMCA during Trump's first term in 2020. An agreement he himself signed and repeatedly praised as one of the best trade deals in American history. Over those decades, entire industries were built around the assumption that goods could cross the northern border with minimal friction. A single vehicle rolling off an assembly line in Ontario or Michigan might contain parts that crossed the border 6 or 7 times before final assembly, each crossing adding value at a different stage of production. That model made North American manufacturing extraordinarily efficient and extraordinarily vulnerable to exactly the kind of sudden tariff shock now unfolding. Auto industry analysts have warned for over a year that a 50% tariff applied broadly to this kind of integrated supply chain doesn't just raise the price of a finished car. It can raise it multiple times over as the same components cross the border repeatedly during production, a cascading cost that eventually lands on car buyers in Detroit as surely as it does in Toronto. This is also not the first time steel, aluminum, and lumber specifically have been at the center of a Canada-U.S. trade fight, and that history is worth remembering because it shows this relationship has weathered serious storms before, even if this current one is testing new legal terrain. Softwood lumber disputes between the two countries stretch back to the 1980s, a recurring conflict over whether Canadian provincial stumpage fees amount to an unfair subsidy for Canadian lumber producers competing against their American counterparts. Steel and aluminum tariffs under Section 232 National Security Authority first appeared during Trump's first term back in 2018, prompting an earlier round of Canadian retaliation at the time, before those tariffs were eventually negotiated down as part of the USMCA package 2 years later. What's different this time is the tool being used. Section 232 tariffs, the ones still governing steel, aluminum, and autos today, are at least nominally tied to a national security justification and a formal investigation process. Section 338, the statute invoked in July, requires no such investigation. It simply requires a presidential determination that a trading partner is discriminating against American commerce, a far lower and far more subjective bar, and one that legal scholars who track trade law have noted gives the executive branch enormous discretion to bypass negotiated agreements, essentially at will. That is precisely why this particular flashpoint carries more long-term weight than the steel and aluminum fights that came before it. There's a wider regional and global dimension here too, one that connects directly back to that January detour into Chinese trade diplomacy. Trump's insistence that Canada choose a side, aligning fully with American trade posture toward Beijing or facing consequences, reflects a broader pattern in how this administration is trying to reshape the entire architecture of American alliances, not just with Canada, but with Europe, with Japan, with South Korea, treating trade access to the American market as conditional on geopolitical alignment, rather than treating it as a stable, rules-based system governed by existing agreements. For Canada, a country whose economy is more deeply integrated with the United States than almost any other bilateral relationship on the planet, roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports flow south of the border. That puts Ottawa in an uncomfortable position. Canada cannot simply pivot away from the American market the way a more diversified economy might attempt to. At the same time, it cannot afford to be seen internationally or domestically as simply capitulating to pressure on sovereignty-adjacent issues like critical minerals access or independent foreign trade relationships. Carney's approach throughout this crisis has been an attempt to walk that line, offering real, substantial concessions on the sectors Washington cares most about: steel, aluminum, autos, alcohol, while holding firm on the sectors that touch Canadian sovereignty and long-term strategic positioning, particularly critical minerals, which Carney has stated explicitly Canada will never grant the United States exclusive access to. And this is where the story gets more complicated than a simple story of Canada standing up to a bully, or alternatively, a story of an ungrateful neighbor refusing reasonable terms. However, either side wants to frame it for domestic audiences. Because both governments have genuine leverage over the other, and neither can fully escape the relationship, no matter how badly this week's headlines read. The United States needs Canadian steel and aluminum to feed its own manufacturing base at a price and volume that alternative suppliers cannot easily replace without years of new investment. American automakers rely on parts and vehicles that cross the Canada-U border multiple times during assembly, a manufacturing model built up over 3 decades under NAFTA, and then USMCA, meaning a prolonged tariff war raises costs for American car buyers just as surely as it does for Canadian ones. American dairy, appliance, and agricultural equipment exporters are about to feel real pain once Canada's September 8th countermeasures land in industries and states that are anything but abstract to Washington's political calculations. Meanwhile, Canada's vulnerability is structural and much harder to escape. There's no other market on Earth that can absorb the volume of Canadian exports currently flowing to the United States. Not the European Union, not China, not any combination of alternative partners. Ottawa has spent years trying to cultivate through diversification efforts that have, so far, made only modest progress against the sheer gravitational pull of proximity to the world's largest consumer economy. What hasn't been resolved, and this is the honest strategic assessment underneath all the political rhetoric on both sides, is the fundamental disagreement about what a stable, long-term trading relationship between these two countries should actually look like in a world where the American president is willing to invoke emergency statutes to override negotiated agreements whenever domestic political incentives demand it. Section 338 has now been demonstrated as a usable tool, not a theoretical one, and that precedent doesn't disappear even if this particular standoff eventually gets resolved through fresh negotiations. Every future Canadian government, and frankly every other American trading partner watching this play out, now has to build its risk calculations around the reality that formal trade agreements with the United States may not be the final word on tariff exposure, that century-old statutes can be dusted off and deployed with a 30-day countdown clock whenever Washington determines a partner is, in its own judgment, discriminating against American commerce. For Canada specifically, the coming weeks carry genuine consequence. The retaliatory tariffs are scheduled to take effect September 8th, and between now and then, expect intense back-channel diplomacy, because neither side has an obvious incentive to let this standoff calcify into a permanent feature of the relationship heading into the formal USMCA review process next year. Watch for whether Washington signals any willingness to revisit the terms that blew up the near deal, particularly around critical minerals access and the specific auto sector provisions that reportedly caused the final breakdown. Watch for whether Canadian provinces follow through on lifting the American alcohol bans as a goodwill gesture even without a finalized broader agreement, a move that would cost Ottawa little politically while potentially building momentum toward de-escalation. And watch closely how American industries directly hit by Canada's countermeasures, dairy producers, appliance manufacturers, agricultural equipment makers in politically significant states respond in the weeks after September 8th, because their lobbying pressure on the administration may end up mattering more than anything said across a negotiating table in Ottawa or Washington. It's worth pausing on the human and economic scale of what's actually at stake here, beyond the headline tariff percentages, because numbers like 50% and $20 billion can start to feel abstract if you don't connect them to something concrete. Canada is the single largest foreign supplier of both steel and aluminum to the United States, a position built over decades of integrated production that no other country, not Brazil, not South Korea, not any European producer, can replace quickly at the scale American manufacturers currently depend on. When Canada's retaliatory tariffs on American steel take effect on September 8th, American steel producers exporting north will feel it immediately in an industry already operating on thin margins and heavily exposed to global oversupply from countries like China. On the dairy side, Canada's supply managed system, which caps domestic production and protects Canadian farmers through tightly controlled tariff rate quotas, has been a target of American trade negotiators for years, going back well before this particular administration, because it effectively locks out most American dairy exports beyond a small quota threshold. Washington's new 50% tariff on Canadian dairy products is, in that sense, less about market access and more about applying direct pressure on a politically protected Canadian industry that successive governments in Ottawa, regardless of party, have refused to dismantle. Then there's the lumber and building materials angle, which connects directly to another politically sensitive issue on the American side, the cost of home building. American home builders have spent years warning that tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber and other building materials like plywood, doors, and cement directly increase the cost of new home construction, at a moment when housing affordability is already a major political flashpoint in the United States. A 50% tariff layered on top of existing lumber duties doesn't just hurt Canadian sawmills in British Columbia and Quebec. It ripples directly into American construction costs. Another example of how a tariff aimed at pressuring a foreign government can end up landing, at least partially, on American consumers and American industries that depend on the very goods being taxed. There is also the question of precedent for other countries entirely. The European Union, Japan, and a range of other American trading partners are watching how this plays out with more than passing interest. Because if the United States is willing to bypass a trade agreement it personally negotiated with its closest geographic ally, its largest single source of imported steel and aluminum, and one of only two countries sharing a land border with the continental United States, then no existing trade relationship anywhere in the world can be considered fully insulated from similar treatment. That is arguably the most underreported angle in this entire story. This isn't just a Canada-United States dispute over hockey sticks and dairy quotas. It's a live demonstration of how durable, or how fragile, the entire post-war architecture of negotiated trade agreements actually is when tested against a presidency willing to treat those agreements as a starting point for negotiation rather than a settled conclusion. There's one more thread worth pulling before we get to where this all leaves us, and it's the question of what happens if this standoff simply doesn't get resolved quickly, because that scenario is now genuinely on the table in a way it wasn't a year ago. If both sides dig in past September 8th, past Thanksgiving, past the end of the calendar year, the damage stops being a story about specific tariff lines and starts becoming a story about permanently rerouted supply chains. Businesses do not wait indefinitely for governments to sort out their differences. A Canadian manufacturer facing sustained American tariffs on its products has every incentive to start looking seriously at other markets, at automation that reduces reliance on cross-border shipping, or in the most extreme cases, at relocating production entirely. The same is true in reverse for American companies dependent on Canadian steel, aluminum, or agricultural inputs. Every month, this standoff continues. The incentive to build permanent alternatives, rather than wait for a return to the old status quo, grows stronger on both sides of the border. That is the quiet, unglamorous mechanism by which trade wars cause lasting economic damage long after the headlines move on to the next crisis, not through the sticker shock of a single tariff announcement, but through years of quietly rerouted investment that never comes back, even after the political dispute eventually cools down. It's also worth considering what a genuine off-ramp might realistically look like, because neither government has burned every bridge here despite the tough rhetoric. Carney has been explicit that Canada remains willing to drop its own retaliatory tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos, and to encourage the alcohol bans to lift if Washington comes back with terms that don't require Canada to concede ground on critical minerals, or accept what Ottawa considers unreliable, shifting terms. That is a real standing offer, not a closed door. On the American side, Trade Representative Greer's own comments suggest the administration still frames its position as generous, offering what it calls the best treatment of any major trading partner, which implies Washington believes a deal remains within reach if Canada is willing to accept the version of the agreement that nearly closed before it fell apart in the final hours. The gap between those two positions, at least as both sides have described it publicly, may be narrower than the dramatic headlines suggest. Whether that narrow gap gets bridged before the September 8th retaliation deadline, or whether both sides instead use the next several weeks to test how much economic pain the other side is actually willing to absorb, is likely to say more about the political incentives inside each government than about the substance of the remaining disagreements themselves. So where does that leave things, ultimately? Mark Carney has staked significant political capital on the bet that Canada is better served walking away from a flawed deal than signing something that trades away long-term leverage, particularly on critical minerals, for short-term tariff relief. Donald Trump has staked his own credibility on the claim that unprecedented pressure, deployed through tools most administrations never touch, produces better terms for American industry than conventional negotiation ever could. Both bets are now being tested in real time, with real economic consequences landing on real workers and real industries on both sides of a border that, for most of the last century, was treated as the safest, most predictable trading relationship on the planet. Whether that predictability returns through a renewed deal before the September 8th retaliation deadline, through the formal USMCA review process next year, or through years of grinding tit-for-tat economic friction that gradually reshapes how deeply these two economies remain intertwined, is genuinely still an open question. What isn't in question anymore is whether either government is willing to blink first simply to preserve the appearance of a stable alliance. As of this week, the answer from Ottawa, at least, is no. And that single decision, more than any tariff line item buried in a custom schedule, may end up being the detail people look back on as the moment the oldest trading partnership in the Western Hemisphere stopped being something either country could simply take for granted.